Nightshade, Chapter 1, Root of All Evil. Alistair released a heavy sigh as he ventured into hell's darkest forest alone. His smile twitched, but he forced himself to maintain it in spite of the dread that filled his bright red eyes. The air around him became thicker as he took care not to trip over the massive root system that coated the ground before him. With another deep, shaky breath, Alistair took a seat upon one of the larger roots as he began to intently stare at the tree before him.
"Why, if it isn't my favorite soul, what brings you to my neck of the woods?"
inquired the root of all evil as her upper torso emerged from the tree's knothole.
"As you know, the extermination is being moved up by 6 months.
Alistair began, taking care not to allow his composure to slip in spite of how tense his shoulders had just become at the mere sight of his tormentor.
My, that is tragic,"
Rue remarked, as she smiled at Alistair expectantly. Alistair's grin faltered a bit as he kicked off his loafers and placed his feet upon the root in front of him, in order to present his argyle socks to Rue.
"I suppose you need more power? You know, going up against an angel is quite the foolish risk,"
Rue then remarked as Alistair glared back at her, his eyes filled with disgust. "They can be killed. Carmilla Carmine managed to do so. I can use this information to leverage the princess to our side, but it might result in us going to war," Alistair explained with a look of determination. When Rue only proceeded to stare at him in response, he released a sigh of frustration mixed with disgust, before then proceeding to snatch off his socks and toss them aside. He then slammed his cloven hooves back upon the root before him with a small glare.
"If that is what you wish, Alistair."
Once Rue's roots had begun to wrap themselves around Alistair's feet and ankles, the radio demon released a small gasp, growing even more tense as the roots snaked their way up the legs of his pants. A sinister grin slowly began to snake its way over Rue's countenance once she had finally succeeded in getting Alistair's nearly permanent smile to drop. She was the only one who could ever do so to him, and she got off on it. Alistair's breathing began to quicken as he was forced to cover his mouth in order to prevent a scream from escaping at the sensation of Rue entering him. Tears practically gushed from Alistair's eyes as he choked back his quiet sobs into mere whimpers. Beginning to hyperventilate at this point, Alistair stared up at the starry night sky in an attempt to calm himself, as he waited impatiently for his part of the transaction to be over. In the meantime, Stolas sobbed softly as he curled up within the warm thralls of his bed, in a manner similar to that of a dead spider. He clutched his soft, feathery chest in an attempt to soothe the almost unbearable pain, as the words Blitz had spoken to him on that horrible night still haunted him.
"Fuck you, Stolas. You spring this feelings bullshit on me? Are you fucking kidding? Can I get a fucking minute to think after everything you put me through? You pompous, rich asshole."
Stolas remembered the way he froze up in utter shock as each one of Blitz's insults pierced his heart like a flaming arrow. On top of that, what was the imp even referring to? What exactly was it that he thought Stolas had put him through, when the owl had done nothing but try to give Blitz everything he could ever want or need? This was a question that still haunted Stolas throughout the day, whilst also keeping him up at night.
"Treat me like one of your little butler imps? You can't just dismiss me like that. I mean, you royal fucks think you can do this every time. Like you can just play with our feelings because we're smaller and not as important. Well, I'm not letting you, bitch. Let's fucking go."
Stolas flinched at the harshness behind not only Blitz's words, but his tone as well. The owl's beak fell agape in complete and utter shock, as a deep sadness began to overtake him. Stolas' beak quivered as tears began to fill his bright, glowing ruby eyes.
Blitz, I think so very highly of you.
Stolas began, pausing to sniffle as tears began to cascade along his pale cheeks. At the very least, he did think highly of who he thought Blitz was, but now that the illusion had been shattered, Stolas was unsure if he even recognized the demon that he had just bared his most vulnerable parts of himself to.
I didn't realize you thought so low of me.
The owl's voice cracked as he hesitantly turned to face his former crush, of whom just stared back at him in shock.
Goodbye, Blitz.
Stolas bade his former lover a permanent farewell. Once his fears had been confirmed, he could no longer look at Blitz the same way after the unbelievably cruel things that the ungrateful imp had just voiced to him.
Stolas, wait,
Blitz rushed towards the owl prince with a look of regret before he was cut off by Stolas' magic teleporting him back outside of his mansion. It was too late for apologies now. Blitz had already made an active choice to commit damage that could not be undone. The moment Blitz was gone, Stolas collapsed to the floor and crumbled into a sobbing mess. Upon hearing Blitz scream with rage from outside, Stolas released an agonized wail of his own to match. In the present, Stolas released an equally agonized wail as more tears gushed from his irritated, swollen eyes. Since that night, Stolas had not been able to stop himself from crying. The skin on his normally white cheeks and beneath his eyes had become a pinkish tint due to the constant irritation. The poor bird did not even bother to wipe away his endless flow of tears due to how sore his face had become. But it paled in comparison to the dull, empty ache he felt within the pit of his chest. Stolas was just glad that his daughter was currently staying with his ex-wife and her brother. He really would not want her to see him like this. How could you let this happen? The disappointment that King Payman held within his voice as he took inventory of everything that had been stolen from his mansion was something that Stolas recalled clearly.
I'm sorry, Father. We were playing pirates, and I thought he was my friend.
Young Stolas stammered, fighting back tears, as he stared down at his talons with a look of remorse. A friend. Lowly imps like him aren't interested in making friends, son, especially not with powerful royalty like us. No, the only thing a lowly imp would ever want from a prince such as yourself is some sort of gain, Payman explained, with a chuckle provoking his young son to flinch. Let this be a lesson to you, son. Everything in hell is transactional, and everyone in hell always wants something in return. Payman then advised once he saw the tears that fell from his son's eyes. He decided that his son's humiliation for giving an imp the benefit of the doubt had been punishment enough.
Yes, Father.
The little bird squeaked as he watched his own tears drop onto the marble floor, matching his own actions in the present. Stolas suppressed another pained cry with a grunt, as he reached a clawed hand up to tear a few feathers away from his own scalp. His other hand making a fist that began to rapidly pound on the other side of his head. The pain that Blitz had actively chosen to leave him with now was like a pain he had never experienced, and that he could only describe as worse than grief. Perhaps it was grief, in a way, since the character of the man he had fallen in love with had been brutally murdered before his very eyes by a monster he failed to recognize. The pain ate away at his insides, provoking him to sob loudly as it bordered physical. Stolas felt as if this pain had taken on a life of its own and would burst from his chest at any given moment. What crime did he commit to deserve such an excruciating pain? He decided to give the same imp who had stolen from him all those years ago another chance, in spite of how obvious it was that Blitz was only interested in using his grimoire. How could I have been such a fool? Stolas began to scold himself, since his father was no longer there to do so. The Owl Prince then used his clawed hands to begin ripping apart his pillow, sheets, and mattress, for reasons unknown even to him. This temporarily brought relief to the unbearable pain that took over his chest. Once his bed had been reduced to nothing more than a pile of fabric, springs, and smashed wood, Stolas then turned his attention to his bedside table. First, he opted to sweep everything from its surface before flipping it over hard enough to smash it as well. The framed picture of Blitz had shattered instantly upon making contact with the floor. Stolas was quick to fall to his knees in front of it, in spite of the tears that now flowed freely from his crimson eyes. Stolas seethed with anger as he glared down at the crumbled photo with a look of pure hatred. Liar! Stolas spat before shredding the photo with one single swipe of his claws. It was then that another object had clattered to the floor. Another object that had clattered to the floor had managed to capture the owl's attention. It was the flare that the radio demon had given to him yesterday. Stolas carefully picked up the flare to examine it more closely as he began to recall the event. Prince Stolitz, fancy meeting you here. Alistair had managed to catch him outside of the Pride Rings town hall, provoking the owl to jump at the shrill sound of his voice. Stolas had been so enveloped with thoughts of his own that he had barely even been paying attention to his own meeting with the other royals. Oh, yes, you see, I needed to attend a royal meeting to discuss the plans for the upcoming invasion, Stolas shakily explained as Alistair took a mental note of how distracted the bird seemed. I presume no conclusions were reached? You do seem tense, Alistair remarked as Stolas wrapped his arms around himself in a vain attempt to self-soothe. The Owl Prince only nodded in agreement, not wanting to allow someone other than Blitz and Octavia to see him vulnerable. You know, I think we might be able to help each other out, Alistair began, his grin becoming more sinister as he wrapped his arm around Stolas' waist. Normally, his arm would go around his victim's shoulders, but Stolas was at least 8 feet tall. Stolas' head flinched once again before staring down at the center with a look of mild surprise. You want my soul, I presume? Stolas narrowed his eyes slightly with suspicion. Your soul? Alistair's grin stretched, his tone becoming more hushed as his eyes briefly darkened. Heavens no! Alistair then waved off the question with a playful chuckle. All I want from you is an itty-bitty favor from your little book of spells. Alistair then listed his terms. My grimoire? Stolas realized as just for a moment he paused with consideration. He could ask the radio demon for anything he wanted. He could make Blitz do just about anything. No, I'm sorry, but I just can't. I can't enter another transactional relationship. Stolas then refused, remembering that he wanted true love from Blitz, not to keep the imp unfairly tethered to him. Well, if you change your mind, this flare will reach me and only me. Light it up and I will come find you. Alistair strained to mask the disappointment in his voice as he practically forced the flare into Stolas' claws. In the present, Stolas stared down at the flare in contemplation as he stood upon his balcony. He then proceeded to light the flare that would soon fill Hell's indigo sky with a neon red fire. Tears flowed freely from Stolas' tightly closed eyes as the screeches of an owl filled his mind. His knees trembled as he struggled to remain standing, the pain of his broken heart silently threatening to drain every ounce of his energy. As Alistair emerged from Rue's forest with a broken, tearful expression, trembling as his ears folded back against his head. He was quick to take notice of the vibrant red light that now lit up the night sky. Alistair's grin instantly returned upon recognizing the flare, as he was quick to clean his face of any tears. He finally had his ticket to freedom. Stolas wearily glanced up at his flare as the last few sparks fizzled back down into darkness. Stolas' face twisted with rage at seemingly another disappointment before he tossed the empty flare from his balcony with an outcry of utter frustration. You rang. Alistair's bright red eyes then began to glow from the darkness of Stolas' bedroom. Stolas felt his feathers begin to bristle upon sensing the radio demon's presence behind him. I must say, my dear friend, you look like hell. Pardon my pun. Alistair then remarked with a snicker as the disheveled Stolas shakily turned to face him. Alistair, the pain. Stolas managed to stammer out between coughs as he weakly stumbled over to Alistair, clutching his chest all the while. It's too much. It's too much for me to bear. Stolas dropped to his knees, fresh tears escaping as he reached up to clutch his stomach next. Alistair then took a few steps back when Stolas had proceeded to empty the contents of his stomach all over the marble floor. It was mostly bile, since Stolas' nerves had been too twisted to allow him to even eat a little after what Blitz had done to him. I beg of you, make it stop, please. You can keep my grimoire if you wish. Just please put an end to this pain. Stolas begged with a grunt, barely able to speak at this point. Very well. The wind began to pick up as Alistair outstretched his hand to the broken owl. Stolas trembled violently from the pain that racked his thin body, as he weakly reached up to grasp the radio demon's hand. Alistair's eyes widened, his grin stretching so far that the corners of his mouth nearly ripped as his limbs and neck began to stretch with a series of sickening cracks. Stolas watched in awe and mild horror as Alistair's antlers began to grow, his wide eyes darkening. After taking note of what exactly was causing Stolas' pain, as well as how severe it was, Alistair recoiled from the owl prince, scrambling back up against the wall, and as far as he could, as he shrunk back down back down into his normal form. Alistair then released a grief-filled scream that soon turned into a few small sobs, struggling to maintain his smile as tears escaped from his wide, fearful eyes. Alistair, Stolas questioned in mild concern as the radio demon scrambled to regain his composure. You know what the problem is? Alistair squeaked as he quickly wiped all of his tears away. You're too soft. You're in hell, Stolas, and that imp you fell for is a demon. There's no gray area around that. Alistair began after he had forced himself to regain his composure. As Alistair stood back up from the floor, Stolas looked down at his trembling hand in confusion, mentally questioning how Alistair had managed to obtain all of that information from just one touch. There is no love down here. It's either you use others or you get used by them. But I can help you, Alistair then further elaborated. Stolas' only response was to look at him with a tearful, questioning expression. All you have to do is rid yourself of your sense of humanity, Alistair then explained, as he knelt down beside Stolas in order to guide the owl to lie down upon the cold marble floor. You may not survive this, Alistair then warned as he pulled his ritual dagger from his coat pocket. I don't care anymore, Stolas dismissed barely above a whisper, as he refused to even look Alistair in the eye. Alistair nodded in understanding before plunging the dagger into Stolas' chest. Stolas cried out in pain before his sense of reality began to fade into a hallucination. During the operation, Stolas saw a brief vision of himself with Blitz as children. He watched as the young imp playfully chased his own child counterpart into a room where their fight had taken place. Both boys giggling all the while. Then at once the two were adults. This is for everything you put me through. Blitz brandished his pistol in order to shoot the adult Stolas through the heart. I understand this must be painful, but it'll all be over soon. Alistair attempted to reassure Stolas as best as he could. But due to his current state of mind, all Stolas could see standing before him was Blitz holding a ritual dagger with a sinister grin. No, 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 no! Stolas cried out in despair, his screams soon fading into to the screeches of an owl as his tears turned black. After sewing Stolas' wound back up, Alistair grabbed the grimoire from Stolas' bookshelf and then used it to open a portal to Earth. He was finally free as he turned to glance back at the owl of whom he had just left in a pool of his own blood. Good luck, little bird. You are free now. Alistair bid Stolas one last farewell before conjuring up a human disguise and disappearing into the portal. Once the portal had closed behind Alistair, only then did Stolas awaken, opening his now electric blue eyes with a low growl. Chapter 2, The Winged Shadow. Oh, The Winged Dread, I'm sorry.
Stolas! Stolas!
When Stolas awoke to another nightmare, he still felt a bit dazed as his eyes weakly blinked open.
You okay, Birdface?
Once Stolas' vision had cleared, he saw Blitz standing over him, with his hand outstretched to him. Blitz? Stolas sat up to scan his surroundings, only to find himself in the middle of his living room floor. He also found himself to be surrounded by Luna, Octavia, Millie, Moxie, Fizzarolli, and Osmodius, all dressed in formal attire. What's going on? Stolas questioned in minor confusion as he stared back up at Blitz with a fearful expression. Yeesh, you must have really hit your head hard when you slipped on that ice cube. Blitz remarked with a slightly hurt expression as Stolas quickly scrambled back up to his feet without the imp's help.
You're at our wedding!
Blitz attempted to remind him as he sported the Asmodean crystal that acted as his engagement ring. Stolas breathed a sigh of relief, beginning to let his guard down ever so slightly, as he mentally began to question if the events of the last full moon had all just been a bad dream. Reluctantly, Stolas knelt down to hug his fiancée for comfort.
Oh, Blitzy, I had the most horrible dream.
On the verge of tears, Stolas tightened his hold on Blitz, practically clinging to him, since he still felt uneasy, unable to shake the feeling that something was amiss. Blitz's only response was a soft chuckle, before running a clawed hand through Stolas' feathers.
Well, now that that's settled,
Blitz began as he pulled away to gaze into Stolas' eyes.
May I have the stance?
Blitz then requested as he wrapped one arm around Stolas' waist. Stolas smiled warmly in response, no longer able to hold back his tears as he took Blitz's other hand within his. Luna used her hell phone to play the song Kingdom Come with a small smirk, as Blitz and Stolas began to engage in the waltz. In reality, Stolas danced with nothing along the silent, dark corridors of his mansion. He was naked, revealing that his feathers were now as black as death. His now ice-blue eyes stared blankly ahead of him, since the owl was in a clear trance. In his hallucination, once the couple had reached the top of the staircase, Blitz had disappeared from Stolas' arms. he and the Owl Prince had become aware of his true gloomy settings. But Blitzy? Stolas called out as he stared down at his empty claws. Despair had once again began to set in as Stolas looked around to find his mansion empty once again.
Stolas?
A familiar shrill voice had nearly caused the owl to jump out of his skin when he whipped around to see none other than his ex-wife, Stella, standing before him. A sinister grin stretched its way over her beak as she held a tearful Blitz at knife point.
Let him go,
Stolas warned with a snarl, only to recoil in confusion when Stella had suddenly began to take the form of his father. After one blink of his eyes, "It's time to wake up, son," Payman advised, before releasing Blitz, of whom now stared at Stolas with a blank, emotionless expression. Stolas watched with horror as Blitz used his sharp claws to begin tearing away at the flesh of his own face. Stolas remained silent as the horns were the last of Blitz's face to fall to the ground with a loud clatter. Now standing before him was a blood-covered Stella, still wearing Blitz's suit, as Stolas could have sworn that he could feel his own body begin to stretch. When the hallucination of Stella began to cackle, Stolas had backed over the railing to his upstairs balcony. However, the fall had been much shorter than he had been expecting. Stolas picked himself up from the floor with a few chirps of confusion, only to realize that he had grown much larger in size. Stolas had soon forgotten to even question why his full form had emerged, when he felt a majority of his memories begin to slip away. Soon all Stolas could focus on was how hungry he felt. He crawled into the kitchen and began to use his now massive beak to root through the cabinets. With a collection of pleased chirps, the now monstrous owl began to devour everything edible he found, no matter how much it had expired. Oddly enough, the more rancid the food item, the tastier Stolas found it to be, as he soon began to eat out of the garbage as well.
Stolas! Come get your daughter!
A familiar shrill voice shouted from the foyer, startling Stolas into flinching. However, since Stolas did recognize his name being called, he began to make his way towards the foyer with a chirp of curiosity, each step he took causing the entire mansion to rattle.
This place is a pigsty. Why the bloody hell are the lights off?
Stella complained as she ventured into the darkness of the mansion. She seemed to be oblivious to the mansion's quaking, of which provoked her brother and daughter to begin scanning their surroundings as best as they could. Andrilphus and Octavia then looked up in horror at the sapphire eyes that began to peer at them through the darkness before the gargantuan black mass that they were attached to stepped into the moonlight's view. Stolas then proceeded to release an ear-piercing screech as drool dripped from the tip of his beak. Stella merely appeared annoyed as Andrilphus gestured for his niece to stand behind him, Octavia hiding her face within her uncle's shoulder all the while.
What's all this then? Another one of your tantrums? You're a grown man, Stolas. It's high time you start acting like one.
Stella reprimanded before making the fatal mistake of giving her monstrous ex a smack on the beak. Stolas flinched back in mild surprise as he began to examine the being who had just struck him more closely, with a low snarl. He recognized her pheromones as someone of whom he had once mated with, but she seemed to be posing a threat to him now. Stella then shrieked in agony when Stolas had then proceeded to devour the upper half of her torso. Judging by the being he recognized as one of his offspring, Stolas mentally deemed that Stella had long since served her purpose.
Mom!
Octavia tearfully cried out in horror as her face was splattered with a sickening mixture of blood and stomach acid. Once Stolas had slurped up her mother's intestines as if they were spaghetti noodles, and Andrealphus stood frozen in utter shock, wondering if he were in a nightmare as he watched the lower half of his sister drop to its knees, before being the next to be swallowed whole by the owl-like beast. "Via, wait!" Andrealphus finally managed to find his voice when Octavia had blasted her monster of a father in the face with the magenta flames that she was able to summon from her palms. Tears fell as she released a cry of pure rage. The only effect her flame seemed to have on Stolas was to temporarily disorient him as the beast of an owl shook himself off with a small squeal. Stolas then turned his attention to the being he recognized as his offspring, his nostrils flaring. She, too, was now posing a threat to his survival. His instincts told him to absorb her DNA back into his body and remake her with a more suitable mate. He decided he would do just that. "Via!" Andrealphus screamed with terror as he watched as the beast then proceeded to swallow his niece whole. To his horror, he could hear her screams all the way down Stolas' throat, until she had finally reached his stomach, only to quickly be incinerated by its acids. After having just witnessed his sister and niece being brutally murdered before his eyes, Andrealphus finally found the courage to tearfully blast Stolas in the face with a beam of ice. Stolas recoiled with another small squeal before setting his sights on his brother-in-law. Half of his face had been temporarily frozen, but the ice was already beginning to quickly melt from his feathers. Stolas then treated Andrealphus to the same fate as his ex-wife and daughter. Meanwhile, heaven and hell were at war due to the normally annual extermination being moved up by 6 months. Charlie Morningstar, the princess of hell, had made the bold decision to fight back against the angels under Alistair's guidance. Unfortunately for her, hell was on the verge of losing the war, as a majority of her people had already been killed by the Exorcist angels, including the newest member of her rehabilitation center, Sir Pinchus. To make matters worse, Radio Demon was nowhere to be found, in spite of his prior promise to help protect the hotel. At the end of her tether, Charlie finally allowed her rage to fully take over, her eyes glowing in neon red as she sprouted intimidatingly long horns and a tail. "Razzle! Dazzle!" Charlie then proceeded to call her bodyguards to heal before summoning her trident. Razzle and Dazzle circled each other for a bit before transforming into dragons. "Charlie, no!" Lucifer watched from the rooftop of a distant building as his daughter and her girlfriend both hopped onto their respective dragons to fly into the dangerous battle. Knowing that his daughter was still too outnumbered to win the battle, Lucifer pulled a small horn from his pocket and blew it in order to summon his familiar. Once Stolas had finished devouring the last of Andrealphus, he perked up at the familiar, eerie sound of a horn. Stolas loudly screeched in response to the horn, still able to tell that it was a summon specifically for him, even if in his unstable state. Upon hearing the sound again, Stolas took to the skies with another screech in order to follow the direction that the sound had been coming from. "Are those fucking dragons?" Adam's eyes widened with a mixture of fear as well as envy once he saw Charlie and her girlfriend Vaggie speeding towards them on the back of beasts that were twice his size. "We can hold them off," his assistant Lute reassured as she readied her spear. The two were then caught off guard by an approaching screech before turning to see a monstrous owl, darker than the night sky, swooping in towards them, his wingspan long enough to shadow cities. "What the fuck is that?" Adam exclaimed as the owl-like beast turned a majority of his army to stone with a blast of red fire. Adam watched with growing concern as a large portion of his army shattered upon the cement of the streets of hell. With her spear ready, Lute placed her back against Adam's in order to guard him from behind as she watched as Charlie's dragons either began to rip through or burn the rest of Adam's army. Lute carefully took aim as she attempted to ignore the fear that began to fill her as the three massive flying beasts that surrounded them. Lute then launched the spear towards Vaggie, managing to lance it through her shoulder. Vaggie screamed in pain as her golden blood began to spill from her wounded shoulder. Dazzle roared with rage in response once his rider had been struck. "Vaggie!" Charlie cried out in concern before just barely managing to dodge a heavenly blast from Adam's guitar. "Watch out!" Vaggie warned, having to avoid a strike from Adam's holy instrument herself. Adam then attempted to shoot Stolas, but the bird was quick to dodge the blast of golden light by springing upwards into the clouds. "Where the fuck did he go?" Adam instantly began to panic once the beast had disappeared from his sight. Adam and Lute then both proceeded to cry out in pure agony when their delicate wings had been shattered by Stolas' massive talons wrapping around them. Charlie and Vaggie then proceeded to cheer with triumph as Stolas tossed the shattered angels to their deaths with a screech. The small remainder of Adam's army then attempted to make one last attack on Charlie's hotel, but were stopped by the gargantuan, intimidating owl landing upon its roof. The hotel quaked beneath his talons, the walls beginning to crack as his claws dug into them. "Retreat!" one of the remaining angels announced once Stolas had spread his wings with a threatening roar. Soon after the remainder of the angelic army had fled back to heaven, Lucifer smirked to himself as Charlie and Vaggie both watched Stolas with matching looks of confusion. Both girls wondering the exact same thing. Just where had this beast come from, and what was he? With a few chirps, Stolas began to scan his surroundings for more enemies. They all looked and smelled the same to him. Charlie, Vaggie, and Lucifer then all watched with minor confusion once Stolas had taken flight again. The army of cannibals that Alistair had helped Charlie gather before fleeing hell got a sinking feeling to run as the huge beast of an owl began to swoop down towards them. Their screams were soon silenced once a blast of Stolas' crimson fire had turned them all to stone. Charlie and Vaggie's jaws dropped in disbelief as they watched as Stolas began to lay waste to the remainder of their own army. Huss grabbed Nifty and attempted in vain to shield her attempted to shield the two of them with his wings before they were petrified as well. Angel Dust fled down an alleyway in an attempt to seek shelter, but he was unable to escape the ruby flames either. A look of dread soon fell over Lucifer's countenance as he watched his own familiar circled back around towards his daughter's hotel, solidifying everyone and everything in his path towards it. Stolas circled the hotel, blasting it with his ruby flames all the while, before deciding to fly through it. The tall building crumbled to the ground with ease, managing to crush any other demons attempting to flee. "Attack, Razzle!" Charlie instructed with a low growl after all of her hard work had effectively been destroyed in a matter of seconds. "Charlie, wait!" Vaggie warned as Razzle took flight towards the owl beast that was much larger than him. No, Charlie, no! Lucifer watched helplessly as his daughter ultimately flew towards her own demise. Let's see. Hold on just 1 second. I accidentally spilled some of my drink here. Okay, flew towards her own demise. Okay, when Charlie released a war cry that was a mix of both between rage and grief, Razzle took this as his cue to breathe fire into Stolas' face. Stolas grunted softly before turning to fly away, but Razzle's flames seemed to have no effect on the owl beast, even as Razzle continued to blow them along his backside whilst chasing him. Vaggie then took it upon herself to command Dazzle to breathe fire into Stolas' face from head on in order to aid her girlfriend. Stolas responded by breathing his own fire back at Dazzle as the two beasts continued flapping their wings in order to suspend themselves in flight as their flames collided for a good 10 minutes. Charlie used this distraction as an opportunity to have Razzle lace his fangs into Stolas' thick neck. The two began to spiral towards the ground as Razzle struggled to penetrate Stolas' thick, hard, almost scaly feathers. As Stolas began attempting to snap at Charlie with his humongous claws his humongous claws violently began to shred Razzle's chest. Charlie readied her trident in preparation to attack, but ended up dropping it by accident once Razzle had released Stolas with a yelp in response to one of his own, and in response to the owl ripping off one of its horns. Charlie! With concern, Lucifer began to make his way towards the plummeting dragon, only to scream in agony when Razzle had managed to catch himself from crashing, dousing Lucifer with his scalding blood in the process. As Razzle fled the battle, yelping profusely, Charlie struggled in vain to make him turn back around to attack Stolas. In the meantime, Dazzle then proceeded to attempt to attack Stolas under Vaggie's command, only to squeal in pain when his claws were crushed within Stolas' much larger talons. The two beasts almost looked as if they were dancing as they began to spiral towards the ground, spitting fire at each other all the while. Vaggie released a small grunt when Stolas had aimed his red flames upward, turning her to stone in an instant. Dazzle released another yelp when Stolas' flames had managed to petrify one of his wings as well. Vaggie! Charlie practically sobbed as she watched as Stolas finally released Dazzle from his grip. Dazzle squealed helplessly, desperately flapping his good wing, as the weight of his stone wing caused him to plummet to his death, with the now statue of Vaggie permanently frozen to his back. Charlie had completely forgotten about Stolas as she commanded Razzle to fly over the smoke-covered battlegrounds. As Charlie desperately searched for her girlfriend, she was completely caught off guard when Stolas had emerged from the clouds of the smoke to rather effortlessly bite off Razzle's head. As Razzle's headless corpse began to fall from the sky, Charlie tearfully outstretched her arms in acceptance of her fate, after having realized that she had now effectively lost everything. The silence and stench of death filled the air as Stolas flew back towards the mansion that now served as morbid den to his pure primal form. In a panic, Lucifer began to bolt through the shambles the owl had left behind in search of his daughter, knocking over and breaking the petrified cherry bomb in the process. To his horror, he found that she had been crushed to death by Razzle's decapitated body. Tears finally escaped from his widened eyes at the realization that he had finally lost everything as well, as he dropped to his knees from the weight of his grief. Pain soon turned to rage as he silently swore vengeance upon his former familiar. I think this is Chapter 3. Chapter 3, Monster You Created. It had been a long, painful day for Lucifer Morningstar after having to plan a mass funeral for his own daughter and all of the people she had fought so hard in vain for. The guilt practically crushed his soul as he sat at his desk and somberly stared down at what used to be Charlie's favorite rubber ducky when she was little. Lucifer then jumped when he had been startled by a loud static from his radio suddenly turning on. "Salutations!" Alistair practically mocked him through the radio static as he used his powers to control the radio frequencies to contact the King of Hell from Earth. "You." Lucifer narrowed his eyes at the small radio once the initial shock had worn off. "You promised my daughter you would protect the hotel. Where were you?" the fallen angel demanded as fresh tears escaped from his puffy, swollen eyes. "I truly am sorry I had to miss out on all the fun. But you see, a more important client required my attention. Someone more capable of assisting me with my dilemma than your daughter. So naturally I had to split. You understand, right?" Alistair taunted further. Stolas. Lucifer's eyes widened at the realization that the radio demon may have had something to do with him losing complete control over his familiar. "What did you do?" Lucifer picked up the radio as his eyes began to glow a bright red. He also sprouted horns that were similar to Charlie's, only more crooked than hers. However, his wrath only provoked Alistair to chuckle with amusement, since he was now all the way in another realm. "I set us free," Alistair responded with a more sinister tone. "What's that supposed to mean? Did my familiar make a deal with you? How? Why? There's no way a more powerful prince would want help from a loser sinner." Lucifer voiced his denial out loud. "Aw, what's the matter? Does it bother you that your little birdie is no longer your slave?" Alistair teased with a slight pout to his tone. "Mark my words, I will make you pay for this. I'll make you all pay," Lucifer growled, as all 4 of his wings began to sprout. Angering the king further, Alistair had left the radio with the song, "Hey, hey, hey, goodbye." Naturally, Lucifer's only response was to crush the radio with his bare hands, before forcing his normal form to return. Lucifer would then make his way to the house of Carmilla Carmine, the angelic arms dealer. As Carmilla answered the door before the king could even have a chance to knock, the angelic arms dealer answered the door before the king could even have a chance to knock, almost as if she had been anticipating his arrival. "My familiar went haywire again. Do you still have it?" Lucifer darkly requested. Carmilla nodded in response before leading her boss inside, her 2 daughters watching with mild concern as Carmilla led Lucifer down to her basement, before turning on the light to reveal the massive skull of Stolas' father. Lucifer then watched as Carmilla carefully pulled the protective sheet from what appeared to be a gigantic crossbow on wheels. "Does it still work?" Lucifer then inquired as he took a skeptical look at the weapon that had not been used for decades. Without another word, Carmilla took her place behind the crossbow and aimed it carefully at Payman's skull. She then proceeded to desecrate the remains further by firing one of the enlarged versions of the angelic spears into its eye socket, just as she had done all those years ago when Payman was still alive. "Perfect." Lucifer then nodded with satisfaction, before arranging to have his army surround Stolas' mansion in the meantime. In the meantime, Blitz returned to his apartment late at night, exhausted from another long day at work. "Looney, I'm home," he announced as he entered what he expected to be his small apartment. He was quick to rub his eyes in disbelief once he found himself in the foyer of Stolas' mansion. The heavenly aroma of his favorite meal being cooked filled the air, as a puppy version of Luna happily sprinted over to him. "Daddy!" The puppy cheered before hopping into her adoptive father's arms, wagging her tail all the while. Blitz had forgotten to question why Luna appeared to be younger, as a sense of normality had completely taken over his brain. Luna giggled as Blitz gave her a loving nuzzle before entering the kitchen to find Stolas standing at the stove and a child Octavia sitting at the table. Stolas hummed a soothing tone as he cooked dinner for his perfect family.
Stolas?
Blitz questioned, beginning to feel as if something were amiss that he could not pinpoint.
Welcome home, Blitzy.
The owl purred as he turned to flash Blitz a small warm smile. His eyes filled with the same unconditional love that his mother once had for him. Blitz felt a strong sense of sadness begin to overtake him, but he strived to ignore it before taking a seat at the table. After a nice dinner, Blitz tucked Luna and Octavia into their bunk beds after giving both girls a kiss on the cheek. Blitz then turned to see Stolas glaring at him with a look of pure disgust. Stolas stared at Blitz as if he were staring right into his soul, and he loathed what he saw. The look of utter disappointment from someone who had once looked at him with a look of genuine adoration filled Blitz with a deep sense of dread.
Stolas?
Blitz finally broke the silence with a fearful squeak, beginning to feel as if he had made the worst mistake of his life. Without another word, Stolas stormed off, provoking Blitz to chase him into the room where their last argument had taken place. We could have had this, you know. You just had to ruin it like you ruin everything else you touch. Stolas coldly spat, just barely masking the grief that filled his voice at the shattered dream. Before Blitz could even have a chance to retort, he took notice of the fact that Stolas' mansion had suddenly been reduced to the ash that now fell around them like snow. I was the only one who truly cared for you. The only one to ever show you any respect. And this is how you repay me? Stolas' head slowly began to turn to look at Blitz, but the imp turned away as the memories of the full moon began to rush back to him. He could not bear to see the pain he had caused Stolas a second time, even though the pain that filled the owl's once ruby eyes was a sight that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The distress was so great that it had startled Blitz awake. He sat up from the couch, practically hyperventilating, as he clutched his pounding heart in a vain attempt to soothe the pain. Blitz then got dressed in a hurry before bolting out the door, knowing that he needed to make things right somehow. After picking up a potted juvenile Venus flytrap from Helmart's gardening section, Blitz began to make his way towards Stolas' mansion at a great speed. As Blitz fumbled over his words in an attempt to practice a half-hearted apology, he could not shake the feeling that something was horribly wrong, and that he might have even been in mortal danger. Cursing softly beneath his breath, Blitz slammed on his brakes, bringing his van to a screeching halt at the sight of Lucifer's army surrounding Stolas' mansion. Blitz felt his blood run cold as he began to mentally question if his initial arrangement with Stolas had been found out.
Stolas!
Lucifer fought back tears as he shouted at the large, gaping hole where Stolas' front doors had once been. Lucifer felt the grief and rage over his daughter's death boil within his blood, as he clenched his fists, ready to face his traitorous familiar. A chill ran along the spines of everyone once the eerie sound of chirps akin to that of a demented dolphin rang out from within the darkness of the mansion. At first, Lucifer had only been looking up slightly, since Stolas normally took on a form much smaller took on a much smaller form. But then his gaze fell into a look of terror. His glare fell into a look of terror as his gaze rose to meet the icy blue eyes that now bored into the corrupted soul. As Lucifer began to wonder just what exactly the radio demon had done to his familiar, everyone had been forced to cover their ears once the ear-piercing screech of an owl erupted into the air, soon turning into a haunting guttural roar. A gurgling sound still rumbled throughout Stolas' throat and chest, even after the roar had long since faded, as the massive ebony beast stepped into full view. "Stolas?" Blitz squeaked softly in mild horror at what his former lover had become. As Stolas began to spit fire into hell's already blood-red skies, as a warning to his attackers, Lucifer's army began to tremble and sweat with fear, some even beginning to back away. Lucifer immediately began to shout calming phrases at his familiar in Latin, but the only thing that truly seemed to work was when Lucifer began to sing the very lullaby he had always sang to the child Stolas. After having been forced to put down payment, Lucifer had to choose another familiar. Had to choose another Goetia to serve as his familiar. Visago would have been the next best choice, but Lucifer felt bad for the owl child he had just orphaned. So he decided to take Stolas on as his new familiar. After his divorce, Lilith had forcefully separated Lucifer from Charlie for a majority of her life, so in her place, Lucifer would raise Stolas until he was old enough to take his own throne. The lullaby that Lucifer would sing to Stolas every night also happened to be the same lullaby that Stolas would end up singing to his own daughter, Octavia. Lucifer strived not to show any fear as the monstrous Stolas leaned in to sniff him, his hot breath nearly knocking his master over. Although Stolas was unable to understand why, the melody made him feel oddly comforted. Stolas gradually felt his mind beginning to clear as he fought to keep his eyes from closing. For the briefest of moments, Lucifer felt himself beginning to regret his initial plan as he reached out to pet Stolas' large beak. But upon remembering that this beast had killed his biological daughter, Lucifer began to radiate with a hostility that Stolas was quick to sense. Before Lucifer could even have a chance to touch his familiar's beak, Stolas petrified him along with any other unfortunate soul that just so happened to be standing behind him. Stolas' jaw dropped with a I lost my place. Blitz's jaw dropped upon watching as Stolas had killed his own master along with a bunch of other demons. With their leader now dead, screams erupted from the remainder of Lucifer's army as they all attempted to flee.
Hold to your courage! Hold to your wit!
Zestial attempted to calm everyone as Stolas devoured the screaming V's with one single bite. Carmilla Carmine struggled to quickly load her massive angelic weapon as Stolas began to take flight, the wind from his massive wings knocking many to the ground in the process. "No," Carmilla cried out in despair once Stolas had turned Zestial to stone from his distance in the sky, along with a few other screaming demons. Carmilla growled with a grief-filled rage as she aimed the giant crossbow at the sky. "Where are you?" she practically snarled as she fought to see Stolas through not only the smoke-filled skies but her own tears as well.
"Stolas!"
Blitz nearly sobbed at what had become of his former lover. Blitz had seen Stolas turn to a monster to defend himself before, but this time Stolas seemed to have no control over his own actions, as if he had completely snapped. Gradually becoming distraught, Blitz began to fear the idea that he had done this to Stolas, that his cruelty towards the lonely prince had driven him to lose all sanity beyond the point of no return. Blitz was then startled out of his thoughts when the severed head of Missy Zilla had been dropped onto the hood of his car by none other than Stolas, of whom had just finished slurping down her tail. It was then that one of the gigantic angelic bolts had missed Stolas' head by just a few inches. The wind from the passing arrow was enough to capture the beast's attention as he now began to swoop in towards Carmilla. Blitz watched on in mild concern as he quickly hopped out of his van. Carmilla scrambled to reload the crossbow as Stolas gradually opened his beak in preparation to attack, the interior of his mouth shining a neon red. Carmilla gritted her teeth before firing another bolt. Stolas released a yelp, kicking his legs once the bolt had pierced his right shoulder. Blitz's worry grew as he helplessly watched as his former lover began to spiral towards the ground, squealing with pain all the while, as blood leaked from his wounded shoulder. Carmilla smirked with a triumphant laugh before grabbing another bolt to reload. However, once Stolas had managed to catch himself, shaking off the pain with a hateful glare, Carmilla found herself frozen with fear as she stared deeply into his hypnotic eyes. She was then turned to stone along with her weapon before Stolas had then crushed them both beneath one of his massive talons with a defiant roar. I keep losing my place. Defiant roar, where is it there? Blitz then proceeded to sneak a bit closer as he watched as the whimpering Stolas began to stomp towards his backyard. Against his better judgment, Blitz decided to follow his beast of an ex, still in denial of it being too late to fix things. Okay, Nightshade, final chapter, Freebird. Stolas snored softly as he rested beneath the very tree that he and Blitz had once played beneath when they were children. Blitz had recognized the tree almost instantly as he snuck towards the monstrous Stolas. Tears stung the brims of his glowing amber eyes, since the sight of what had become of his childhood plaything saddened him greatly. Finally, the consequences of his actions had begun to sink in, as he listened to the small whimpers that had escaped from the giant owl, blood pooling beneath the poor creature, as he attempted to sleep off the pain. Blitz choked back a sob as he then took in all of the pain that he had inflicted. Inflicted upon someone who had once loved him more than his own mother ever could. Tears finally escaped as he reached out to grab a hold of the spear that was still lodged deep into Stolas' shoulder blade. Blitz's claw had just barely brushed against the wood of the spear's handle when Stolas' large sapphire eyes had suddenly popped open, focusing their cat-like pupils upon the imp. Blitz began to fearfully back away as he watched as Stolas had opened his massive beak, the interior of his mouth glowing a bright red, in preparation of attacking the imp.
Stolas, stop! It's me! It's me, Blitzy! Remember?
Blitz frantically begged for his own life, only relaxing once Stolas had froze at the sound of his voice. Blitz began to tremble with fear as the wide-eyed beast began to sniff him.
You know what? This was a mistake. Let's just go. Stolas, don't pretend there's anything between us other than you wanting to fuck me, alright? What? Fuck you, Stolas. You spring this fucking feelings bullshit on me? Are you fucking kidding? Can I get a fucking minute to think after everything you put me through, you pompous rich asshole? Treat me like one of your little butler imps? You can't just dismiss me like that. I mean, you royal fucks think you can do this every time. Like you can just play with our feelings because we're smaller and not as important. Well, I'm not letting you, bitch. Let's fucking go.
That voice. Somehow, even in this twisted, demented state, Stolas still remembered everything that voice had aggressively shouted at him, clearly. even though he could not remember the meanings of any of the words spoken other than his name. He could very clearly remember the pain that voice alone had inflicted upon him. The worst pain he had ever felt in his entire life. A pain so agonizing that he was unsure if he would survive. Was this imp that stood before him a predator? Stolas began to back away as he spread out his wings behind himself in an attempt to make himself look bigger than he already was. His beak clicking at Blitz threateningly when when he had backed himself up against the tree that was behind him. His eyes wide with pure terror. Yeesh, I sure did fuck you up, huh? Blitz anxiously scratched the back of his head as he mistook Stolas' primal threat posture for calmness. Assuming that Stolas had recognized him by now. Stolas, listen, I really am sorry about what happened. The truth is, I didn't believe someone as important as a prince could love, well, someone like me. I'm really bad at this sort of thing. What I said to you the other night was cruel. When what I really should have said was, I love you too. I have for a long time, and if I could go back in time and treat you better, then I would. Fuck. Can we just go back to the way things were? Blitz tried his best to apologize as Stolas stared back down at him intently. The beast genuinely did try to listen to the being he now viewed as a predator, since he did not sense any hostility from him. However, Stolas struggled to understand what the imp was trying to say to him. He sniffed the imp once again as he studied his body language closely, but no matter how hard Stolas tried, he just could not make sense of any of Blitz's words. Blitz hesitated a bit before reaching out to touch Stolas' beak. Stolas flinched a bit, but ultimately allowed the imp to do so, out of fear of what would happen if he did not obey him. Oh, I get it. I gotta kiss you to turn you back to normal, right? Blitz nervously guessed a fairy tale ending as he struggled to ignore the dread beginning to build within his chest once his confession had failed to return Stolas to normal. Blitz then leaned in to gently kiss the tip of Stolas' beak, as the large owl just stared back down at him in confusion. Blitz's eyes began to fill with tears as he frantically began to plant multiple kisses along Stolas' beak. Stolas flinched away at the sudden movement, his feathers bristling as he began to clack his beak once again. No, what have I done? Tears fell as Blitz dropped to his knees, beginning to swear in between his frantic sobbing. Fearing that he had lost Stolas for good and had no one other than himself to blame, Stolas began to sniff Blitz once again out of curiosity as he approached him with caution. He then chirped in mild concern once he had sensed the smaller being's pain. Stolas, I'm so fucking sorry. It's all my fault you're like this. I ruined your life too. Blitz sobbed as Stolas once again chirped softly. Don't worry, I'm not gonna abandon you again. I don't know how, but I'm gonna make this right. Blitz then swore as he stood up to once again take a hold of the spear that was embedded deep into Stolas' shoulder. However, when Blitz had begun to attempt to pull the spear from the beast's shoulder, the sense of unbearable pain that shot through Stolas' nervous system provoked the owl to shriek in agony. Stolas then began to panic once his known predator had begun to inflict pain upon him again, just as he had feared. Whoa, Stolas, calm down! Blitz begged, holding on to the spear's handle for dear life as Stolas hoisted him off of the ground in order to begin to flap his massive wings with another pain screech. Blitz screamed in terror once Stolas had taken flight into the sky in an attempt to escape his perceived attacker. However, Blitz still managed to maintain his grasp upon the spear wedged into Stolas' shoulder. Even as the panicking beast attempted to shake him off, Blitz fearfully looked down at the ground below him, wrapping his legs and tail tightly around the spear's handle. Once he saw just how high Stolas had flown. "Stolas, please!" Blitz begged for mercy that would not come to him upon feeling the spear slowly begin to slip from Stolas' wound. With each rapid flap of his wings, Blitz then screamed in horror once the spear had fully become dislodged from Stolas' shoulder. The silhouette of the massive owl flying beneath the current full moon was the last thing Blitz saw before his world went dark for good. A little later into the night, the root of all evil was awoken by a series of eerie squeals. "Yes, yes!" A sinister grin stretched its way over her countenance when she looked up to see Alistair's most recent work approaching her swiftly. Surely he would not leave hell without sending her a replacement after everything she had done for him, she assumed. "Come to me, my new pet." Rue cackled, only to shriek in agony once she had been crushed to death beneath Stolas' gargantuan talon. Once the beast had landed, Stolas shook the dirt and blood from his feathers with yet another whimper, as he panted softly in a vain attempt to soothe his pounding heart. Stolas. Just then, a still small voice had captured the beast's attention as a heavenly light began to shine down upon him. "Long ago, you made a mistake." The voice of none other than God himself began by reminding Stolas of his decision to give up his life as an archangel and follow Lucifer's army to hell, along with the rest of his family. This was a mistake that the meek and timid Stolas would regret, allowing both Lucifer as well as his own father's lies to deceive him into believing that they could create a world better than heaven. A world Lucifer claimed would be more equal. Stolas was only a child when he had made the decision that would ultimately ruin his life. Hell was hell for a reason, after all. And as a result, a majority of Stolas' life would be spent in sanity-corrupting misery, in spite of his pure-hearted intentions. However, I can see, even now, that your heart was always pure. You destroyed Lucifer and even the root of all evil. For that, I am willing to give you another chance, God explained as the heavenly light that surrounded Stolas became warmer and brighter. Now taking on a more human form, the now naked Stolas gasped for air as he fell to his knees, angelic wings sprouting from his back. He was now fully healed from both his physical as well as his mental wounds, as he began to pant frantically. All of his memories had fully returned to him, but they now felt like more of a bad dream, as he stared back down at his trembling hands. You will become a guardian angel for someone very important. When they die, you will then be allowed to return to heaven with them. God then explained further as Stolas nodded understandingly. The light to heaven then became a portal to earth as Stolas stood back up to his feet with a look of determination. Stolas then used his powers to transform into a normal earthly gray owl before flying from the destroyed hell for good in search of the being he would be assigned to guard. The end.